Welcome back to the Leaders in Security video interview series, an initiative from the International Security Journal. And we're back for episode 2 with Joe Autera from the Vehicle Dynamics Institute. So welcome back again, Joe.
Thanks, John. It's great to be back.
So following on from episode 1, you've worked pretty much around the world, many places, having such a global experience with experiences in across the Americas, Australia, the UAE, Saudi, Russia, and Nigeria, just to name a few. Are your students across the world experiencing the same issues, problems, and challenges?
Absolutely. As we talked about in episode 1, when you talk about vehicle dynamics and the laws of physics, it's the same the world over. If you see behind me, that equation, which really determines the success of or failure of a driver in a behind the wheel emergency, that doesn't change no matter where you are in the world. The challenge is to get every driver up to the highest possible level of performance in the platform they're driving, so that should they be confronted by that behind the wheel emergency, they don't have to think about this math and science, they just drive it.
So across the world, different countries, different cultures, different demographics, pretty much different infrastructure control the speed of vehicles. And what I mean is the speed of which vehicles could operate, not necessarily should, but could. So how do you deal with the different perceptions around how fast is fast?
Well, again, it comes down to applying the science and training based on that science, allowing for those environmental differences. We come in, and it's interesting when we deal with the local population, right? We come in, we have a certain technical knowledge, but what they have is in-depth knowledge of the environment. So our training process for those overseas mobile training projects begins with a lengthy brief, most of the time over telephone or video, to understand what are the challenges they're dealing with, what environment they're in, and what vehicle they're in, and then building exercises based on our core exercises, but making sure we're building exercises and training on surfaces that are very similar to those which they're going to encounter when they're working, and then of course taking them up incrementally taking them up to a level of performance. So we understand to build that familiarity and understanding, you can't stop at the top. You can't start at the top of the hill. So we start at the base and work them up, allowing them to see, feel, hear how that vehicle is performing and start to understand where their own limits are. Because you're absolutely right. There's a speed you can drive at and there's a speed you should drive at. There is a number of degrees that you can rotate the wheel, and then there's a number of degrees that you should. And those are both related, by the way. That's what this formula up here shows us, is how much load is on the vehicle, which determines how much control you have, is a function of how fast you're going and how far you turn the wheel. In order to get the student to understand that, you have to start them out at a baseline, build up their performance capability based on understanding and their comfort with that, and then allow them to experience those incremental changes that come with the incremental changes in speed.
So are there any, expectations or challenges that cut across all cultures across the world? Do you find the same types of issues?
Well, you do. The first thing that we do run across is, when the students file into the room, every single student there thinks they're the best driver in that class, and they may or may not be. But universally, these behind-the-wheel emergencies come down to not only the driver, vehicle, and environment, but the vehicle's capability. They can only go, stop, and turn. That's it. There's a tendency on the part of most humans to make things more complicated than they need to be. At the end of the day, no matter where you are, it comes down to the driver being able to go, stop, and turn in that particular vehicle as to whether or not they will be able to overcome the challenges of limited time, limited distance, and limited maneuvering space. in that behind the wheel emergency. It doesn't matter where they are in the world. Those rules of three, if you will, right? The driver, the vehicle, the environment, go, stop, and turn, and limited time, limited distance, and limited maneuvering space all come into play. So, of course, naturally, we have to incorporate all of those factors in our training, which can get pretty complex at times when you're working in a location where the only training site are publicly accessible roads, and the mobile police have to shut off, the intersections you're training in. And oh, by the way, there's a 3-foot storm drain / sewage ditch running right next to that road. But now you're half a world from your primary training site. The students are there, the vehicles are there, the client doesn't want to hear, we're not going to be able to do this. So you have to adjust accordingly while allowing for those factors, all of those factors in your training.
I was just going to ask you, just on that point, for those, I guess, internationally deployable security drivers who might be part of a security team that works with their principal around the world, when they start moving into different types of vehicles that may be rented, may not be their own, and now all of a sudden they have different vehicle characteristics, how do you deal with that in training?
Well, step one in that situation, which is not that uncommon, even in some less developed regions of the world, it's not necessarily uncommon to find the drivers being moved to another locale or country to operate in. And it's not uncommon for them to be using vehicles they're unfamiliar with, including rental vehicles. Now, that may not be the best solution, but it is what it is. So from there, we're strong advocates of the drivers, number one, spend time familiarizing themselves with the control schematic of the car. Where is the shifter? How many times have you jumped in a car that has a column shifter and reached for the console shifter in your personal vehicle? But more importantly, what about door locks and door handles? Do we know how to activate those? In a behind the wheel emergency, if we did have to evacuate the vehicle, you don't want to be reaching for the door handle on your Kia sedan while you're driving a B6 armored Land Cruiser L200. It's not going to work out well for you. So first, we are strong advocates of them familiarizing themselves with the controls, and then familiarize themselves to the extent that they can safely do so with the vehicle's characteristics. Find a wide open area, wide open lot. Drive the car, especially those vehicles that are equipped with advanced driver assistance systems. Drive the car to the point that the electronic stability control system engages so you understand what that engagement feels like. Make sure you're engaging the ABS brakes so you make sure you understand what that is going to feel like and what the feedback from the vehicle will be. Those are absolutely critical to the driver being able to perform well. And obviously, the more time they spend in that vehicle, the more familiar and at least in theory, the more capable they will be in it. But from the onset, they've got to have that capability. The client or principal doesn't want to hear, oh, sorry about your luck. We weren't really familiar with these vehicles. That is not what they pay us for. And as we say, when that client asks, is this what I pay you for? It's a rhetorical question. They already know the answer, and it's time to go see HR and do your exit interview.
So how long should a professional, and I use that word particularly, a professional security driver, allow for becoming familiar with a piece of equipment, which is not only transportation, but has the potential to kill someone, either themselves or someone else or everybody? How much time should they be allowing for to familiarize themselves with not just the operations, but the characteristics of that vehicle?
That's a challenging question. The answer is as much time as possible. And we'd love to say, hey, you're going to go in 2 or 3 days in advance of the principal or in advance of the EP team. That's not always going to be the case. But if you know that you're going into an environment and going to be operating vehicles that you have very little familiarity with, the goal always is as much time as possible, days as opposed to hours. And then you want to drive those vehicles when you're doing the advance, right? So if the advance team is there and you have the opportunity to access those vehicles, the driver should be driving the advance team, and they should be deliberately, when that advance team is out advancing a location, that driver should be familiarizing themselves with the controls. And then once they're done with that process, again, go back to that wide open space in a safe manner without driving at excessive speed or making too aggressive inputs. Learn that vehicle's characteristics. And as often as you can during the detail. When the principal's back at the hotel or at the restaurant, do you have the opportunity? Sure, I can sit in the vehicle and manipulate the controls. When they're in the hotel for the night, I can take that vehicle out to a lot and get some more, as we call it, stick time, right? To learn those characteristics. Just like it is with trainers, professionals in any aspect of executive protection, need to be lifelong aggressive learners. Otherwise, you run the risk of failing to meet your objective. And the cost of failure, as you know, in this industry is far too high to pay.
So a topic that is often discussed around this training and this familiarization is defensive driving versus evasive driving. And there always seems to be a bit of a focus, certainly on, I'm a good driver. I've done defensive driving courses. I'm perhaps a security professional, or maybe I've done some executive protection courses. Why should I be going to the next level to learn evasive driving? Like, what's that driver? I guess. What's that motivation really? Why should we do it?
Well, it comes down to some basic principles, right? Defensive driving, absolutely. Drivers should have defensive driver training, and they should apply defensive driving principles and techniques all of the time. But the reality is they are going to be surrounded by people who have not taken defensive driver training. So from a safety perspective, those people without that training may put them in a position that goes beyond the skill sets that defensive driving provides. And then, of course, when you add in the security risks, those are people who are deliberately trying to put a driver in a position that they simply cannot overcome using defensive driving techniques. If you look at the book Just 2 Seconds, written by Gavin DeBecker, Tom Taylor, and Jeff Marquardt, tremendous compendium of information and a truly scientific study that dovetails with Tony and VDI's training techniques. It demonstrates the vast majority of security incidents are going to happen while the principal is in or around the vehicle, and statistically speaking, they're much more likely to face that security threat while they are seated or riding in the vehicle. So now we have to look at what are those conditions that exist in those circumstances. And as we mentioned earlier, limited time, limited distance, limited maneuvering space. Now the driver has to operate the vehicle under stress at a very high level of its performance potential in order to, and do so while maintaining control in order to overcome the security risk.
So you mentioned the statistically backed up by case studies, and I certainly read about this in Just 2 Seconds. The time where the principal and the security team are most at risk is in the vehicle, seated, I believe, versus entering or exiting the vehicle, crossing the pavement, if I'm correct. So that kind of reinforces the importance of the security driver training program, so to speak. Have I got that right?
Yes, that's correct. So when you look at the compendium of information that was compiled in the book Just 2 Seconds, if I recall, globally, 58% of all attacks occurred in or around the vehicle, while 42% of those occurred while the intended target was seated or riding in the vehicle. Coincidentally, in the US, I believe the data showed 64% of all attacks from 1960 to mid-2007 occurred while the intended target was in or around their vehicle. But again, that 43%, if I recall correctly, occurred while they were seated or riding in the vehicle. But now you fast forward, you look in, I believe it was 2014, intelcenter.org did a study on kidnappings. And from January to April, the vast majority of kidnappings around the world occurred while the intended target was driving or being driven in a vehicle. So this is something that dates back before the absolutely groundbreaking work in the book 2 Seconds, even before Tony's groundbreaking work in 1974 in developing this methodology. The reality is the driver becomes absolutely critical when we talk about security risks because of the potential, the high potential for them to happen while that principal is in or around the vehicle and of course then the driver is going to be there as well.
So what we're saying is that the principal is most at risk in the vehicle, which therefore justifies the security driver training program, which from I guess an operational or even an academic point of view is a no-brainer. However, you know, in the real world, we have to deal with accountants. We have to deal with people that don't always just want to give the security team every cent that they ask for. So how do we justify the return on investment of a trained security driver? Like, what's the value proposition for the organization?
Well, you know, regardless of where you are in the world, the value proposition, because keep in mind, potential accidents or security incidents are relatively rare occurrences that our students will face. Some have a higher potential for that given the operating environment and some of the basic risks in those environments. But the reality is most drivers on most days aren't going to be confronted by that behind the wheel emergency. So then the question becomes, where is that value proposition, right? If nothing ever happened, was it because the driver was present or was it because of happenstance? Nobody happened to be planning anything. But when you think about it, think about who we're transporting. These are high net worth individuals, corporate and government officials with a tremendous portfolio of responsibility, and of course, corporate executives. So the return on investment, in our opinion, comes in that case, right, universally, in productivity for the principal. Imagine, if you will, that the principal has to drive themselves every day, an hour and a half, 2 hours of time behind the wheel. On the International Security Driver Association Resource Center, an organization that Tony founded, we just posted an online training module that deals with that business case and return on investment for a security driver. And so take the numbers from New York City, for example. A CEO's average compensation is $14.4 million. They spend about 1.87 hours a day commuting. Right? Now, all of a sudden, you break that compensation into a weekly or hourly compensation rate. You add for those hours, you're talking potentially $1.5 million of lost productivity over the course of a year if they're driving themselves. Then if we assume that a Harvard study that was conducted in 2016, I believe, is correct, and it says the average CEO spends about 47% of their time working out of the corporate office. Even then, at 47%, you're talking over $700,000 of lost productivity if that executive is driving himself. That's a strong case to make for the accountant. Then, here in the US, you have an IRS regulation, Part 132.5, that deals with the taxability, if you will, of executive perks. And if that executive just has an executive chauffeur as opposed to a security driver, that executive is responsible for the tax on the value of that benefit that they're receiving from the company, unless there's a clearly defined business-related security concern. And then that driver and that vehicle are no longer a taxable perk. They're a necessity of that executive's position.
So are there any, I guess, parameters that the IRS talks about for the American firms as to how they define a security driver?
Yes, interestingly enough, as part of that process of justifying it, you have to demonstrate or have an independent assessment that demonstrates that there is an overall security program. And there's many facets of those programs, but the one thing that they require to demonstrate you have that security program is, and this is verbatim, a bodyguard slash chauffeur trained in evasive driving techniques.
So here we go with the justification around evasive versus defensive. So it's not only practically speaking, it's also regulatory.
Exactly.
So an organisation has sent someone to a professional school like yours, and they have achieved, let's use the word competency at whatever percentage is that you determine is appropriate. How does their skill set degrade over time, and at what point do they have to be reassessed and refreshed and updated?
Well, through our research, and keep in mind, we've got data that goes back now more than 4 decades to the origins of the Scotty School, and of course, for the last 17 years, nearly 17 years here at VDI. And we look at returning students because we do have a tremendous number. More than 78% of our students return to us for training. Many of them at this point at VDI, we have seen 15 or 16 times. Recently, we just had a gentleman did his first training with the Scotty School 35 years ago, and now he's training with us. So what we know by all of that, right, long way to get to the point that what we know is if a driver leaves here capable of 85% of their vehicle's performance potential in cornering and compound braking and cornering maneuvers, we know that after 1 year, they'll be somewhere between 75 and 78% capable. At the 24-month period, they're at 65%. So it starts dropping off in that second 12-month period, and it continues to drop off from there. And quite honestly, if you're not applying those techniques every day, those skill sets are diminishing, which, by the way, if they are applying them every day, they're going to get fired and arrested more than likely. But it also places an emphasis on the need then for those surveillance detection skills and a high level of situational awareness so that you avoid, to the extent possible, having to use those skills. Coincidentally, too, the IRS regulations, when you look at the field audit techniques guide that comports with that regulation, it does say that the driver training, in order to have that bodyguard slash chauffeur trained in evasive driving techniques, to meet that threshold, the training has to be accomplished on a recurring basis. They don't say a time frame, but they do say it has to be accomplished on a recurring basis.
So do some of these training competencies differ for a single bodyguard, chauffeur, security driver versus working in a team environment?
Well, I won't say they differ greatly for the solo practitioner. That's a term that we coined around 2006 for that bodyguard slash chauffeur slash advanced guy slash SD operative, right? The guy or gal who wears all those hats, right? It may not differ greatly for somebody who's part of a security team, because at the end of the day, their core driving skills are what we're working on. However, they do have to take into account what their ancillary roles and responsibilities will be. That solo practitioner, they have to do it all. And they have to understand where and when those skills must be prioritized. When is it appropriate to be focused on surveillance detection as opposed to focused on the driving skills? And so that's an important component of a lot of our courses, particularly the custom courses we do and our surveillance detection tactics and techniques courses, as opposed to that driver who's assigned to a team whose role and responsibility is the vehicle and driving. In many respects, that makes the driver's role and responsibilities a little more manageable for that individual because it is so focused.
So with the security driver, or with the aim of any organization and their security drivers, should be around continuing their professional development and constantly learning from new ideas and new, updates to the industry, especially from all the case studies that are available. Are there any reference materials that the viewers could access to remain current?
Sure. If they were to go to our website, www.vehicledynamics.com, there's an article section there that has quite a compendium of articles. things that myself, Tony, some of our staff have written, as well as articles we've found, which we obviously attribute to the authors and the organizations that publish them, that deal with everything from stress, vision, decision, sight distance, specific vehicle capabilities, environmental factors, and of course, advanced driver assistance systems. And, there's a similar compendium with different content on, as I mentioned earlier, the International Security Driver Resource Center, which can be found at isdacenter.org, that will allow those drivers to continue updating their knowledge and building that understanding that they need to be most effective under normal conditions and in those behind the wheel emergencies.
Following on from the last question, how could an organization find the resources and the information to set up a security driver program that ensures both their vehicles and their drivers are aligned to international standards or best practice?
Well, it's challenging because in that niche, there's not necessarily a lot of resources directly available. We do a tremendous amount of consulting work. We're not beating our chest about it, but we do a tremendous amount of consulting work with clients on vehicle selection, including armored vehicle specs, and then quality control and quality assurance on those armored vehicle builds. We look oftentimes with their security team at what their transportation requirements may be on an everyday basis versus in specific locales. So there are resources available to clients. And, I suppose the added benefit they have in engaging us in that process is that it dovetails with the training that their personnel are receiving.
Wonderful. Look, thanks so much for your time today, Joe. There's been so much information for us to absorb and dissect, and we look forward to speaking with you in the future.
John, it's been a pleasure, and I wish you and this program a tremendous amount of success, as well as the International Security Journal. It's a great effort, and I think it brings a lot of value to the global security community.
Look, thanks, Joe, again. And I'm John Cowling, and thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the International Security Journal for industry updates and notifications of future episodes in this Leaders in Security video series. Good night.